Well, let's go ahead and get started, if everybody can find a seat. I apologize, I was a little bit late getting here, and so not everybody got their name tags. So you got to have your name tags. One of the things that we do at the Opportunity Coalition is we ask a question, and the purpose of that question is to get people engaged together. And so the question tonight is, what is the most exotic place you've ever been? If you're Jeff Waston, you said Boulder. Jeff, where are you? We got to work on that one. I don't know where he's at. He'll come sit down in a minute. But write down a place that you've been that's exotic, and it's a good conversation starter. So I'm going to hand these out. Grab your name tag and write that on it.
Boulder isn't exciting?
Well, Boulder's pretty exciting, but he just went there last weekend. So I want to welcome everybody to the Opportunity Coalition. For those who don't know me, my name is Brian Watson, and I'm the founder of the organization. And a lot of people ask, why did you found the Opportunity Coalition? And I did so because I originally come from the western slope of Colorado, a little town of Olathe over there. And I went to school in Boulder, and after graduating from Boulder, I've started a few companies. And what I noticed is that people aren't very connected throughout our state. Just think about, there's some people here from Colorado Springs and other areas tonight. And you may know people in your neighborhood and in your community, but how many people do you know in a community 100 miles away, 200, 500 miles away? And the answer is, as we kind of go out, we know fewer and fewer people. And there's a lot of great, exciting things happening in our state. And so we founded the Opportunity Coalition to accomplish a few purposes. The first is to bring speakers here who are accomplished individuals in different fields and areas. And for those individuals to share their golden nuggets of wisdom, and that you can learn from them and figure out how to apply them to your business, to your nonprofit, to whatever it is that you may be doing in your passion in life. And there's a lot of wisdom from those different speakers that we have. The second thing that we wanted to achieve was to connect people together so that they can go out and create new companies together, create new initiatives together that can impact our state in a positive way, and to really build bridges. You know, oftentimes we're so busy in our life, it's hard. You go to different events and you walk in, and first usually they want your money, and then you walk in and you make a beeline across the room to somebody you know, and you talk to that person, but rarely do you have an environment to get to know somebody and to have some conversation starters. And so this organization is specifically designed for you to go up to somebody that you've never met and introduce yourself and just see where the conversation may lead. I believe some great things will happen, and already some companies have been started through these meetings, some employees have been found through these meetings, and we look forward to seeing what the future impact will be. So with that, I'd like to get to our honored guest and speaker tonight, Attorney General John Suthers. I'm going to read a little overview about his bio because his accomplishments are substantial. Attorney General John Suthers was appointed Attorney General of Colorado in January 2005. He's been doing this for almost 10 years, and he finishes his term this coming January. After serving for nearly 2 years, in November 2006, he was elected by a large margin, I might add, to serve a full 4-year term, and he was re-elected in 2010 by another large margin. As Attorney General, John represents and defends the interest of the people of the state and is chief legal counsel and advisor to the state government. John has initiated successful programs to protect children from internet predators and to reduce mortgage and foreclosure fraud. Prior to becoming our Attorney General, John was nominated by President Bush to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Colorado, where he represented the United States in all criminal and civil matters within the District of Colorado. Before that, Governor Bill Owens appointed John as the Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Corrections, where he was in charge of nearly 6,000 employees and an annual operational budget of approximately $500 million. John started his career in private practice in Colorado Springs until his first run for public office when he was defeated by an incumbent to be elected district attorney of the 4th Judicial District.
I actually won.
Well, it was written down, oh, you defeated them, yeah. You know, it just all that, just that nuance right there. So John has never lost an election and never will. Okay, we're not going to go that far, but if we're going to start, you know, we might as well. I apologize for that. After 2 terms, he returned to private practice until the call from Governor Owens. John has authored 5 books, including his most recent, No Higher Calling, No Greater Responsibility. A prosecutor makes his case. He graduated magna cum laude from the University of Notre Dame with a degree in government in 1974 and from the University of Colorado School of Law in 1977. John and his wife, Janet, have 2 daughters. Allison is a deputy district attorney in Denver, and Kate is a procurement analyst for the Defense Department in Pearl Harbor and a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserves. With that, please help me welcome Attorney General John Suthers.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks to the Opportunity Coalition for the invitation to join you this evening. Folks, it's a great honor and privilege for me to serve as the 37th Attorney General of Colorado. You know, when I graduated from the University of Colorado Law School 37 years ago, I had a very vague and undefined notion that I wanted to spend a portion of my legal career in public service. So imagine how I feel today, having served as the elected district attorney in Colorado Springs, as the presidentially appointed United States attorney here in Colorado, and for the last 10 years as your attorney general. I like to tell all my legal friends I feel like I've won the legal trifecta. For a lawyer interested in public service, it doesn't get much better than that. I want to do 2 things tonight. Number one, I want to tell you why I think being Attorney General is the best job in state government. A lot of people hear about the Attorney General, you see us involved in cases, but not many people have a pretty good sense of the breadth and scope of what the Attorney General does. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And then the wisdom that Brian talked about, I'm not sure it's wisdom, it's up to you to decide. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've set goals for myself in terms of deciding among many opportunities that I presented what direction I'm going to go. To me, my life goal, at least my secular goal in life, is to become a good ancestor. And I'm going to tell you what I think that entails in the modern culture. So first of all, let me tell you about the Attorney General's office. I'd like to tell you I do all this, handle 10,000 legal issues for the state of Colorado and the people of Colorado by myself each year. That's not how it works. I've got 450 employees, including 275 lawyers. And I can tell you right now, with the way the legal environment is, we're attracting very good lawyers to the office of the Attorney General. They've got expertise in a wide variety of areas, as you'll find out in just a second. We're involved in about 1,600 cases every year in the state and federal courts on behalf of the state of Colorado. We're divided into 7 operational sections. I'm just going to run through those quickly and just give you an idea of all the kinds of things that we do. First is business and licensing. It's your legislature, the Colorado General Assembly, that decides what businesses or professions they're going to regulate. Now, the fact of the matter is every state regulates certain businesses and professions. The medical profession, the legal profession, the dental, nursing, architecture, engineering. Colorado licenses plumbers and electricians. Colorado licenses barbers and cosmetologists, real estate agents, mortgage brokers, a whole bunch of folks. We even license outfitters, guys that take you on a tour for a fee. When the legislature chooses to regulate a business or profession, they usually set up a board or commission, usually with expertise from the industry. They determine what the requirements are to be licensed, what kind of test is going to be given. They determine what the continuing education requirements are, and when necessary, they revoke, or at least attempt to revoke the license. But anybody whose license is subject to revocation is entitled to an administrative proceeding before a judge. The fact of the matter is nobody ever died of a bad haircut. Barber licensing revocations aren't very exciting. People do, unfortunately, die every year from substandard practice of medicine in the areas of neurosurgery or cardiac surgery. And it's important that we have very good attorneys handling cases where the medical board, the dental board, nursing board has decided as a matter of public safety, we need to seek to take away a person's license. You're talking about a neurosurgeon, he or she's making $2 or $3 million a year. They don't want to give up that license very easily. A lot of expert witnesses involved, things like that. We need good lawyers handling that because of the public health, safety, and welfare that's at stake. We represent some 40 commissions or boards of that nature. Now, moving to the next section of the office, revenue and utilities. What's the other thing that government does? It taxes, right? That's what the raison d'etre of government, it seems. And your state imposes income taxes. It imposes sales taxes. It collects, oversees assessments statewide and all that sort of thing. That's for the most part through the Department of Revenue. And we have a section called Revenue and Utilities that does all the work of the Department of Revenue. I will tell you the good news from my perspective is the Department of Revenue, I think, bends over backwards to work with taxpayers to try and resolve tax conflicts. It's very rare. And only after the taxpayer has essentially thumbed their nose at the Department of Revenue that cases are referred to us for civil or criminal collection. But it does happen. I think the most famous case of recent was Doug Bruce. Did more than just thumb his nose at the Department of Revenue and wound up being convicted of several counts of tax evasion. We also, in that section, represent the Public Utilities Commission. In fact, the Attorney General's office represents the 3 commissioners. It represents the staff in another section, and we represent the Consumer Council, which by statute advocates for the interests of residential and agricultural ratepayers. So that's important work. We've got, for example, we've got an appellate case right now against Public Service Company, which is an old subsidiary of Excel, and the result will determine whether Colorado gets to keep $110 million it collects or it has to go back to the taxpayer. So a lot of these cases have a lot of money at stake. Next section of the office is state services. In some ways, the most interesting. State services represents the governor, the treasurer, the secretary of state. Maybe that's why Wayne Williams is here. He's running for secretary of state. He wants to know, what exactly the attorney general does for the secretary of state. Represents all the institutions of higher education, state-run institutions of higher education, the state's Board of Education, and a variety of departments. Just like in the federal level, we have like 14, 15 cabinet departments in state government, and the Attorney General's office represents them all. I think what's very interesting about the state services section is because they represent the Secretary of State, they get involved in an awful lot of constitutional litigation. As you know, it's remarkably easy to amend the Colorado Constitution, and the citizens do that with some frequency. I think they've amended the Colorado Constitution 155 times since 1912. And sometimes they amend it in a fashion that someone believes is a violation of the United States Constitution. And a couple of times they've been right. Let me just give you an example. A couple years ago, the voters passed something that said, if you have business with any level of government, let's say you have a contract with a Fountain Sewer District, you can't contribute to candidates at any level, including the governor's campaign. Well, folks, that was blatantly unconstitutional and was found so by the courts. But as you know, that's some of the things that we see on the ballot with the ease that it is to bring issues to the ballot. Perhaps that'd be a discussion in the question section. We do a lot of the constitutional issues. We just completed a 3-week trial in federal district court where we are defending the despite my personal opposition, two of the gun laws passed by the legislature last year, universal background checks, limitation to 15 rounds per magazine. My job to defend state laws, and we just completed a 3-week trial, and that was done by the State Services Section. The University of Colorado and Colorado State University, by agreement with the Attorney General, is allowed to have an in-house counsel's office, but they are all deputized as special assistant attorney generals. We represent all the rest of the colleges and universities in their entirety. The next section of the office I want to talk about is civil litigation and employment. For the most part, there's a general proposition in the law called sovereign immunity, which means you can't sue the government. But governments routinely waive sovereign immunity and let you sue them for certain things. And there's something in Colorado statute called the Governmental Immunities Act. And if you go to it, it says, public entities in Colorado are immune from suit except for the following. And it has a list of things that you can sue the government for. So if you leave here tonight, you're at a stoplight, a state employee driving a state vehicle on duty for the state of Colorado, plows into the back of you and injures you, you can bring a claim against the state of Colorado for the negligence of that employee because the state allows you to do it. Driving through the mountains, unfortunately this happens a half dozen times a year. Rock rolls down, hits your car, causes injury. If you can show that the state negligently maintained the highways, you can bring a claim against them. Wards of the state, inmates, mental patients, things like that. If they're a victim of medical malpractice or whatever in the institutions, they can bring a claim against the state because the state allows them to. But because we're talking about taxpayer money, the state's allowed to put caps on its liability. Up until last year, those caps were extremely low, $150,000 per person, $600,000 per incident. Folks, in a case like in 2004, when a bridge abutment collapsed on I-70 and killed a family, the most they could collect was $600,000 from the state, despite the negligence of state employees. Last year, we raised it to $450,000 per person, a little less than $1 million per incident. But in a situation like the North Fork fire, state employees negligently maintained a controlled burn, got out of control, burned 1,400 acres, 44 dwellings. At that time, the limit was $600,000, doesn't go very far. And there's very limited means around it. We've tried to show them a way, but so far they haven't been taking advantage of it to the extent that we would like. Now, if you sue the state under federal law, Section 1983, a civil rights violation, a state patrolman, accuse them of false arrest, a state correctional officer, there are no limits under state law for state liability. So we want to have very good lawyers over in federal court handling cases because those verdicts can sometimes be big. And we do about 20 federal cases a year. We do about 300 state, tort sorts of cases, mostly traffic accidents, things like that. Obviously, of course, you can sue the state if you're in a contractual relationship, you believe they breached the contract, stuff like that. Now, when do we need to sue somebody? As I say, if the state feels like they've been the subject of a breach of contract, we can sue them. The other thing, of course, we do is condemn property, right? When you have a T-Rex project right through the middle of Denver, or well, what do we call Colorado Springs? Can't remember the name of it. But
Cosmics.
Cosmics, that's exactly right. A lot of properties have to be acquired. Typically, the state goes out, offers what they think is a very fair price, but the citizens have a right to a jury trial if, in fact, the government's going to take that property for public use. And we do that sort of litigation. We also, of course, defend the state against any claims by employees who allege they've been improperly terminated or improperly disciplined under the state personnel system. We handle about 300 cases of that nature. There's 32,000 state employees in the state of Colorado. Now, natural resources, important in any section of the country, but in the West, incredibly vital. You're about to go into an attorney general's campaign, and I can almost guarantee you all the advertising is going to be about criminal cases and consumer protection cases and everything. I would suggest to you that probably the most important thing that the attorney general's office does day in and day out for you is protects Colorado's interests in water. For those of you who aren't sophisticated about water and think, you know, when you turn on that shower in the morning and the water comes out, that this is all a really easy proposition. It's not. Let me give you the Water Law 101. This is a dry, arid, high arid plains. We only get like maybe 17 inches of moisture a year. That's low on national standards. But it does snow in the winter, and in a month, the next month, it's going to start melting. And for the most part, all the snow melt on the east slope is going to run down into a couple river basins, out into the Mississippi River, down to the Gulf of Mexico. On the west slope, it's going to run into the Colorado River Basin, and that which is not taken will get to the Gulf of California. But folks, how much Colorado gets to keep of that water and how much it has to give to 18 other states or countries, include Mexico, that rely on that water is dependent upon 9 interstate river compacts to which Colorado is a party. And many of these were negotiated a long time ago. Colorado River, for example, 1924, I think, could be 22, 1924. And, you know, there's natural tensions. We want to keep as much water as we possibly can. The other states want as much water as they possibly can. So we fight about it a lot. The Water Division in the DA's office likes to say that the state motto is whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. And there's a lot of truth to that. I had the privilege in 2008 of arguing a case in the United States Supreme Court. It was the 13th iteration of Kansas versus Colorado that it had gone to the Supreme Court since 1902. Kansas, every 20 years, whether we like it or not, sues us saying they're not getting enough water in the Arkansas River. Right now we're in the Supreme Court on 2 cases. Kansas has sued Nebraska and Colorado over the Republican River. Northeast Colorado goes up into Nebraska and down into Kansas. Texas has sued Colorado and New Mexico over the Rio Grande River, claiming they're not getting enough water. When a state sues a state, the case starts in the United States Supreme Court under Article 3, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. It doesn't start in a lower court. It goes right to the Supreme Court. They usually appoint a special master that hears it, but any unresolved issues, the court itself resolves. Very, very important part of what we do. We're also, of course, concerned about air quality, water quality, and for the last 30, 40 years, the cleanup of hazardous waste sites has been a huge issue in Colorado. There's been a lot. We had a long mining history in Colorado, and we've had some defense-oriented sites that were pretty problematic environmental sites. Rocky Flat being one of them, plutonium plant. Rocky Mountain Arsenal, 18 square miles northeast of Denver. Let me just explain that because it's a good example of what we're talking about. Rocky Mountain Arsenal was a chemical weapons plant for the Army in World War II. At the end of the war, they leased it to Shell, which had an agricultural pesticide plant there. When that terminated in the very early or late 70s, this was a pretty gnarly environmental site, and it quickly became what's called a Superfund site under CERCLA, the federal environmental law. Colorado sued in 1983 to force the Army and Shell to clean it up. To their credit, they've spent $3 billion, and you can go out there today, and it's a national wildlife refuge. I wouldn't eat the dirt, but the good news is we've got a big buffalo herd out there, and they haven't turned orange, so we feel pretty good. It's actually, there's only 1 square mile that's not open to humans, and it's really quite a nice wildlife refuge. The lingering problem that was still going on when I came in was, hey, there's certain things you can't fix, and how much is Colorado owed for that? And it was all about groundwater contamination. And I went to the top of Shell and the Department of Justice represented the Army, and after many years of loggerhead, we were able to settle that for $45 million, which has been largely reinvested in the South Platte Valley out there adjacent to Rocky Mountain Arsenal. But we've done, we've had settlements at Summitville Mine, we've had settlements at California Gulch, which was molybdenum contamination in the upper reaches of the Arkansas. It's a big part of what we've done over the last decade or so. Let me turn to consumer protection. We really have two focuses, one Colorado and one national. We enforce the Colorado Consumer Protection Act. If you go to the Colorado Consumer Protection Act, there's a whole list of what are called deceptive trade practices, various forms of false advertising, and that we're responsible for pursuing. And we bring claims probably 100 to 150 a year against companies operating in Colorado for various sorts of misconduct. But on a national level, we're also involved in antitrust cases and, in some cases, violations of the Colorado Consumer Protection Act. Let me just give you a couple of the more interesting cases of recent. I was the lead Republican in the national mortgage settlement, which was a settlement with the 5 largest banks in the country. Some of them you work for, I noticed when I talked to some people here. They serviced 2/3 of the mortgages as we went in and out of the foreclosure crisis. And frankly, there was some fairly serious misconduct in terms of the servicing of mortgages. It revolved around several things. A lot of states have what are called judicial foreclosures, where you actually tender an affidavit to a court saying, this is the status of the loan, this is its delinquency, and oh, by the way, we are in possession of all the necessary documents to show the assignments and everything to show that we are, in fact, entitled to foreclose. As it turned out, you heard the term robo-signing. There were so many foreclosures going on. They would file the judicial affidavits when in fact they didn't have the documents in their possession, and when they got into contested situation, they would try and recreate them. One can argue about what, if any, damage these people still had not made payments, but in fact they were making false representations to the courts. There was a big problem with something called dual tracking, where the banks were actually dealing with the customer and saying, if you do this, 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 or this, we will modify your loan for the next 6 months while you're trying to find employment. And unbeknownst to the folks doing the modification in the bank, and unbeknownst to the customer, another part of the bank was going full bore ahead with a foreclosure. And we had like 250 documented cases where people brought in this canceled checks, brought in all the correspondence, they did everything that the bank asked them to do, and they still went forward with the foreclosure. A lot of the banks, despite the criteria for requiring mortgage insurance, were telling people who weren't required to get it that they needed to get it, and guess who was selling it to them? So there's a lot of misconduct involved there, and as you remember, the case ultimately settled for $25 billion. Kind of a short story there. The first day of, I had people in my office that went to the negotiations every week, but the AGs involved would go about every month, and one of the settlement, where the banks were going to make their first offer of settlement. I was there, everybody's very interested. We're at a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., and the Wells Fargo general counsel, outside counsel, is making this proposal saying why they don't have any liability, but to get this all behind us, we'll settle for $5 billion. And I was pretty well briefed on the case right now and knew the case was worth a lot more than $5 billion, and said, in a nice sort of way, I said, frankly, I'm a little insulted by that offer, and went on to explain why. That night, in my hotel room in D.C., I was thinking, when I was in law school, did it ever occur to me that I would tell somebody that just offered $5 billion with a B dollars that I was insulted by their offer? But how time flies. We have had a lot of inflation since 1970. I don't think we've had that. Let me tell you some of the more interesting litigation we're in right now. Standard & Poor's. As you know, a big part of the financial crisis was securitized mortgage pools. that the investment banks sold, and they sold them to pension funds and institutional investors, some of whom could not invest in those products unless they were AAA rated by law. By law, they could not invest in, including states, by the way, could not invest in unless they were AAA rated. This was a huge piece of business for Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Well, as those of you in the business know, one of the representations that these rating agencies make to the public, to the SEC and everybody else, is that their rating function is totally separate from their financial function in terms of the marketplace and who's paying them to do the ratings and all that sort of thing. When this whole house of cards collapsed, needless to say, and not surprisingly, there was a few whistleblowers out there, and the states are now, as is the federal government, in possession of a great deal of documentary evidence that, in fact, Standard & Poor's was continually lowering the rating criteria to make sure that these maintained AAA ratings in order to be available to institutional investors. So that's a case that out there. One other little fun case. Any of you ebook readers? If you are, you what are you all, illiterate or something? Nobody takes it? Okay. Then you may have gotten a refund recently because this is kind of, we just went to trial against Apple and a group of the largest publishers in the world, and they were found guilty of price-fixing ebooks. Here's what happened. Any of you guys read Steve Jobs' biography? Well, we got a few literate folks here. It's a very good read. The funny thing about it is he confesses to this price-fixing in the book. What happened was, when Amazon came out with an e-reader, they embarked on a pricing model where they'd actually purchase the book from the publisher and put a very small profit in it and sell the book to you for $9.99. And they made most of their money in selling you a Kindle. Well, when Apple comes out with an e-reader, it's within 6 to 9 months of Jobs' death. He knows he's dying. He doesn't like the model that Amazon has. He thinks what you ought to do is enter into a deal with the publishers, not buy it outright, kind of go down the line, charge more, everybody gets a little bigger piece of the action. I think because he was running out of time, he didn't have the ability to negotiate with the publishers one by one, so he flew them all into California, sat them down in a room like this and said, hey, here's what we're going to do. But it's only going to work if you go to Amazon and say, we won't deal with you unless you embark on this same deal. Folks, that's an antitrust violation, price fixing. And we went to trial. The violation was found. All the publishers have now settled. That's what resulted in the refunds and cash payments to folks. Apple has not, although my personal feeling is they're just trying to distance the period of time between the settlement and Mr. Jobs' death so that it won't reflect quite so directly on his reputation. That's just an example of some of the things we're in nationally. Let me move to our final section of the office, criminal justice. It's your DAs that do most of the prosecution of street crime in Colorado. Burglaries, robberies, rapes, murders. My office gets criminal cases the following ways. Number one, the legislature gives us direct jurisdiction over certain types of cases, usually concurrently with the DA. So we can, securities fraud, investment frauds, we can bring those cases directly. And I have a financial crime section that does that. Insurance fraud, I have an insurance fraud section that's funded by fees that's paid by the insurance companies, and we do 100 or so insurance fraud cases a year. Your environmental crimes, we prosecute environmental crimes. We prosecute any of your benefits crimes, Medicaid fraud, Medicare fraud, workman's comp fraud, all that sort of thing. Then in addition, if a case, we have 22 judicial districts in the state, 22 elected district attorneys. If a case goes across state or those district boundaries, by agreement with the DAs, the AG can take the case, take it to a statewide grand jury that sits in Denver, and we do about 100 cases a year that are statewide drug rings. We do a lot of cases against Mexican cartels. We do statewide, sadly enough, human trafficking rings, metro area foreclosure fraud rings, things like that. And we've got a lot of good lawyers doing that. We handle all appeals. We've got 36 criminal appeals lawyers that handle some 1,500 appeals. Anybody convicted in the state who appeals, we handle that appeal. And then we go out and help the DAs, particularly in rural areas. Sometimes they don't have anybody in the office who's handled a murder case. And so we go out and help them do that. We also have a section called the Police Officer Standard and Training Board that gives certificate with 15,000 peace officers in Colorado. This board that I'm chairman of accredits the training academies either in the police departments or in the community colleges, 18-week training programs. We approve the curriculum. We determine the test to be taken by the peace officer candidate. We issue the certificate. Whatever continuing education that we or the legislature requires, and we revoke the certification of about 50, 60 police officers a year for various sorts of misconduct. Now, in addition to this day-to-day stuff, we have initiatives like Brian mentioned. We had an internet safety initiative when I first came in. We didn't have any internet-specific laws to protect children. Now, believe it or not, 400 Coloradans get arrested a year for either internet luring or internet sexual exploitation. We've done a lot in the substance abuse area, and of course that's an amazing area right now, given, here we are legalizing marijuana, creating, in my opinion, a larger pool of adolescents that will be subject to some other drugs. We've got a prescription drug epidemic, and now we're finding that as people are, their supply of prescription opioids is being disrupted, they're moving to heroin, and we have a record number of heroin overdose deaths in Colorado. It's a very complex drug environment right now, and maybe you might want to ask me some questions about that. But let me now move to this matter of goal setting. We all set goals for ourselves, folks. Career goals. At one point in our lives, we had educational goals. Let me suggest to you a goal that I set for myself several years ago, and I found it very useful as I evaluate decisions I'm facing, but more, occupational choices I'm facing and things like that. And that is a goal which I think, to the extent that you have any spiritual goals, this is a secular goal that's wholly compatible with that. And that is to become a good ancestor, to make the lives of those who follow you better because of the way you have led your life. I first focused in on this question, it was quite a few years ago. I was in private practice debating whether to take another splurge into the public sector or not. And I happened to read an article about Dr. Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. And in the course of this article, there was an interesting quote. Salk is reputed to have passed up some opportunities to commercialize the vaccine to the fullest extent possible. And he was questioned about that. And this was his response. The most important question we must ask ourselves is, are we being good ancestors? Given the rapidly changing discoveries and conditions of the time, this opens up a crucial conversation. Just what will it take for our descendants to look back at our decisions today and judge us to be good ancestors? So I started thinking about it. First of all, what exactly is an ancestor? Look it up. There's two definitions, not just people who have children, but also anyone who is a forerunner. So George Washington, who had no children, is an ancestor of ours. Becoming an ancestor is as easy as living and dying. But becoming a good ancestor is not necessarily so easy. Because of the evolution of man and because of human nature, man does not always act inevitably for the good. In fact, human nature being what it is, people often make bad choices that inure to the detriment of others. Hitler is an ancestor of ours. Think about all the experiences of parents making bad decisions that inure to the detriment of their children. Jonas Salk posed the question of what it takes to be a good ancestor. There are two ways, I would submit, one much more common than the other. And to kind of explain that, I'm going to look at a book by an obscure author named John Suthers and just read you a quick passage. Becoming a good ancestor requires effort. It's not a passive undertaking. And when you think about prior generations, I believe we can identify two types of good ancestors. The first is people we have knowledge of because they did something of note to benefit large groups of people. History has recorded their accomplishments. Jonas Salk did in fact achieve his goal of becoming a good ancestor. So too George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Amelia Earhart, Thomas Edison, Mahatma Gandhi, Golda Meir, Martin Luther King Jr., and thousands of other people, accomplished people that preceded us and positively impacted the future, are viewed as good ancestors. The second category of good ancestors, and the most populated one, are all those people who are positively impacted those they had personal contact with in a way that survived their death. I can identify my parents. Folks, my dad died when I was 15 years old, and I absolutely believe that the values that he imparted to me have been absolutely crucial in my life. I identify my parents, several relatives, and several family friends as having been good ancestors of mine because their lives continue to positively impact my life even after their death. They taught me things, often by example, that helped make my life better. I make better choices because of what they taught me. If I in turn teach my children and my friends the same things, the positive influence of these ancestors will transcend multiple generations. Then I just tell a little story about this second type of good ancestor. I recall hearing a story that illustrates very well the second and more common form of good ancestry. A Maasai warrior on the plains of East Africa, despite threats of disease, nature, and tribal conflict, managed to survive to the ripe old age of 40. He never attended school, married at the age of 15, fathered his first child at 16, became a grandfather at 33. He never acquired any material wealth in terms we commonly think of, but he did earn a leadership position in his tribe because of his excellent hunting skills. In fact, while he invented nothing, he taught his sons a special technique he developed for spearing a charging lion. They passed it on to their sons and grandsons, who consequently revere their great-grandfather, whom they never met, as a good ancestor. And indeed, he is. Now, what sort of characteristics do we need to develop and acquire to be a good ancestor? I want to just briefly introduce you to a couple of concepts that are not new ones, certainly not new with me, but I think highly relevant today. You know, if you were burdened like I was to take political science classes in college and read Plato and Aristotle, you can remember it was pretty dry. But the one thing I remember about it was their concept of the virtuous citizens. You know, today, when I use the word virtuous, it has connotations that kind of make you a little queasy. You think of, Mother Teresa or St. Thomas or St. Francis of Assisi, people that were virtuous in a way that very few of us could ever hope to attain. But for the Greeks, a virtuous citizen was really a political term. Virtuous citizens are those who act responsibly in their own interests in the interests of their family and of their community as a whole. Our founders threw that term around, virtuous citizen. James Madison said our entire Republican form of government is dependent on high levels of human virtue. And think about it, how true that is. Folks, in a dictatorship, it's the virtue of the dictator that matters. In a monarchy, it's the virtue of the monarch. But in a Republican form of government, it's the virtue of not only the office holders, but the folks in the corporate suite, the folks in the church pulpit, the folks in front of the classroom, and the folks at the ballot box. And nothing is, we really cannot be the country we want to be unless the vast majority of people are virtuous citizens, in the sense that they're acting not only in their own interest, nothing wrong with acting in your own interest, but their families and the community as a whole. Nothing is more essential to becoming a virtuous citizen or a good ancestor than good character. What makes for good character? I've thought about this a lot, through the years. Is it obeying the law? Hardly. Pornographers obey the law. All kinds of disreputable folks obey the law. Character is more than just obeying the law. So what is it? Let me tell you what I thought was one of the most interesting assessments that I've ever read. About 100 years ago, an English judge by the name of John Fletcher Moulton wrote a paper in which he divided human actions into three domains. The domain of the law, the domain of obedience to the unenforceable, and the domain of free choice. Let me just walk through these briefly. And he separated every single one of our actions into one of these domains. The domain of the law. That is where obedience is required. If we don't do what we're asked to do, or what we're expected to do, the government will seek sanctions. If we commit a murder, the government's going to try and put us in prison or execute us. If we don't pay our taxes, the government's going to try and exact a sanction. The government will impose whatever sanctions are deemed necessary to force obedience. There's not a whole bunch of virtue in this realm, folks. We do it because we don't like the consequences if we don't do it. On the other extreme is this domain of free choice. All those decisions that we make every day which don't have very serious ramifications. I got up this morning and went through the ties and said, this is going to be it. This is the time I'm going to wear today. But would have chosen another one, big deal. You decide at the grocery store whether to get Crest or Colgate. Big deal. Nothing, no consequence. But in between this domain of the law and the domain of free choice lies the domain of obedience to the unenforceable. That's where our actions are not dictated by the law, and there's no sanction attributed to them for not doing the right thing. But not doing the right thing has serious consequences for us and those around us. In my opinion, it's in that domain where character truly resides. Let me give you some examples. Many of you may have children. Okay, you got your 13-year-old, and you're walking up to the ski tow line, or the place where you buy tickets, ski tickets, tow tickets. And there's a sign there that says, children under 13, 12 or under, half price. And you lean over and whisper to your kid, you say, today you're 12 years old. Folks, chances are, even if they figured out government's not going to sanction you for that conduct, that conduct is going to have immense ramifications. It is telling your children that it's okay to cheat. It's a huge message in terms of character. Today, in our society, we've abolished all laws associated with adultery. No legal consequence whatsoever. Adultery has profound impacts on the lives of people, children, and everybody else. I just give you those two examples to show you that, in my opinion, it's this domain where character truly resides. Let's talk a little bit about the culture today. It's a difficult culture to operate as a virtuous citizen with the desire to be a good ancestor. Think about how it deters or promotes virtuous citizenry. There's a lot in the culture that deters it. When I say culture, I'm referring to patterns of human activity and the means by which such activities are given significance and importance. It's typically manifested in such things as music, literature, art, theater, and film. It can be impacted by religion and historical events like wars, famine, and pestilence. Culture, ever evolving, is passed from one generation to the next. You know, you hear a lot of ridicule. I grew up in the Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver generation. You hear a lot of ridicule about that sort of television. But think about it. At least families raising kids at that time could traditionally expect considerable assistance from the culture. The TV show at least had a moral message to it. And I would suggest to you that the inadequacies of parents are less pronounced if there's a healthy culture surrounding a child to help pick up some of the slack. But culture declines when obedience to the unenforceable decline. I challenge you. If you can stand it, watch a week of primetime television and see how many wrong decisions are being made in terms of this domain of obedience to the unenforceable. That's what convinces me that our culture is in fact in decline. John Silver, former president of Boston University, did a marvelous speech in which he said there's no question that the principal culprit has in fact been television in the way we've abused this very incredible educational tool as a society. But the reality is we all as parents and educators have to work very hard to overcome the culture. It has always been the case, always will be the case, going back to a Greek concept. When it comes to our children, our task is to teach them what Aristotle called habits of the heart. What he says is you have to teach a kid to do the right thing from the very beginning so that doing the right thing is a reflex. They reflexively do the right thing. This is a tough environment to raise your kids that way, and frankly, given all the external culture, it's only going to come from parents and people close to a child to teach them those habits of the heart. Let me just wrap up before we take questions by saying I think one of our problems in America today is we've taken the pursuit of happiness too seriously. Jefferson talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you actually look at what he said to expound on that, he's really talking about the happiness of pursuit. And for all of you entrepreneurs out there, I think you'll understand that so much of the satisfaction comes from the pursuit. And that's true in life too. It's not just there can be problems with pursuing nothing but happiness. Happiness is the byproduct of pursuing it in the right way. And many Americans are wholly confused by the difference between freedom and license. Freedom is that which comes with responsibility. License is doing whatever you want because you want. My 6 decades on Earth have given me an indication that there's only 2 essential things for happiness. Number 1, someone to love. It can be family, friends, spouse. I think it could even be your dog. I don't know. But you got to have somebody to love. Human relationships are essential, in my opinion. The other thing is something meaningful to do. And what I found is that whether something's meaningful is 90% the attitude of the person doing it. You know, I told you my father died when I was 15. I'll never forget a conversation we had. We were driving down the road, and he asked me, well, you know, what do you think you want to do? And I'm sure he wanted me to say something stellar, like, Dad, I want to be Attorney General of Colorado. Didn't say that. I said, I want to be a garbage man. I was intrigued with jumping on and off the garbage man. And his response was, I'll never forget it, he said two things to me. He said, John, that's okay. You just make sure you're darn good at it. And let me tell you something, John. He said, on the day that the garbage man picks up your garbage, he's more instrumental to your quality of life than the President of the United States. Folks, think about that. The rotting garbage in your garage would make your life pretty darn miserable, even more miserable than the current President of the United States. So, let me conclude by saying, while there's a lot to be concerned about, optimism is absolutely essential. Good ancestors are optimists. They're looking for ways to impact the people around them. One person can make a huge difference. A family is virtuous when those at the center of the family life are virtuous. A community is virtuous when the citizens who comprise it are virtuous. And I mean this virtuous in a sense of personal and community responsibility. A well-ordered personal life promotes a well-ordered state. And the solution is for each one of us to do everything we can in our own life, in our own jobs, our own schools, our own churches, and most importantly in our own families, to promote civic virtue, obedience to the unenforceable, and I would suggest to you that the world be a lot better place if we all set a goal for ourselves to become good ancestors. Thanks again for the invitation to be here. Hopefully we got some time for some questions.
John, thank you so much. I have a few questions for you. I have about 100 questions. You guys don't mind. A lot of things we can ask you about, but I've boiled them down to 3 that I'm going to start off with, and then I'd like to open it up for questions for everybody in the crowd. First question that I have is, and I don't want to ask about the Affordable Care Act, but I'm curious about the news on how state attorneys general defend their states on that kind of federal law. What is your role?
Okay, that's a very good question, because I was talking to a couple of people beforehand. There's this huge debate going on, and I'm in a debate with Eric Holder about state attorneys general obligation to defend their state laws. And I think, absent on-point precedent, we have an obligation to defend our state laws. As you know, some are refusing to defend state constitutional provisions which they have decided are unconstitutional when no court has yet decided that. In the case of the federal law, I am a state elected official who has an obligation to enforce to uphold the Colorado Constitution and the federal Constitution. And I personally believe, and I think most of my fellows believe, that a big part of our job is to preserve federalism. Now, maybe you haven't heard that term since civics class in high school, and a sad number of Americans had no clue what federalism is. Let me just tell you real quickly. It is that principle enshrined in the U.S. Constitution that says, look, Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to, and there's a list of like 20-some powers that Congress is given by the Constitution. And elsewhere in the Constitution it says all powers not specifically given to Congress are reserved to the states and the people. That's federalism. And it's a huge part of our job, in my opinion, to seek to preserve federalism. So in the Affordable Health Care Act, Brian, when Congress said the mandate to purchase insurance was based on the Commerce Clause, the provision, Article 1, Section 8, says Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. We said, wait a minute. All the case law, as broadly as it's been construed, and it's been very broadly construed, that's been the source of most of the centralization of federal power over the last 100 years, says the federal government has the power to regulate economic activity that impacts interstate commerce. It doesn't say the federal government has the right to create commerce by forcing people to buy a product they may not otherwise buy. And so we challenged it and said it's not a proper exercise of the commerce power. Little known fact, the Supreme Court said, you're right, 5-4. But then, of course, Justice Roberts joined 4 others in saying, but we're going to call it a tax, even though Congress said it wasn't a tax, and the President said it wasn't a tax. And of course, you folks all know that if Congress had said it was a tax, it wouldn't have passed. They had to bribe Ben Nelson to be the last vote anyway. If they had to go to the voters on a $1 trillion tax, it wouldn't have passed. There's all kinds of issues. We've got 33% of the state of Colorado is federal land. We're fighting with the feds all the time about our right to royalties and all that sort of thing. So it's a big part of our job, in my opinion, to make sure that the states are treated as they are supposed to be treated under the concept of federalism enshrined in the Constitution.
A novel concept, states' rights. My next question is, legal issues can be a complicated challenge for business people. Do you have any advice for business people and entrepreneurs here tonight?
I do. Number one, get the best counsel that you can. I'm talking, your accountants, your lawyers. Get people that are well-known in the community and have the ability to get issues resolved. My office gets calls from professionals all the time. Hey, just clarify this thing for me in the business and licensing area or something like that. They then have the assurance that they're going forward. This is this is what we were told by the Attorney General's office. Now, if you call the front desk and talk to the receptionist, she's not going to give you any legal advice. But your sophisticated professionals will know who to talk to and who to get some enlightenment about that. So that would be my number one advice. And don't be afraid to work things out. As I've said, I found the Colorado Department of Revenue, I hear horror stories by some, but I found them, when properly approached, are willing to work through most any issue, and I think that's important.
My last question is, assuming you could be king for a day, what is the one thing that you would change in the law that could have a dramatic and beneficial impact for our country?
In the law.
Or just in general?
Okay,
in the world, maybe.
Okay, folks, I'm 62. In my lifetime, I have witnessed something that I think is at the root of the vast majority of our problems, and that is the heightened levels of family dysfunction in America. Let me just give you the raw statistics. They're really pretty shocking. Last year, 41% of the babies born in the United States were born out of wedlock. 41%. Those break down about 24-25% Caucasian, about 38% Hispanic, 69% of African American babies were born out of wedlock. I'm not sure how long we can sustain as a society with that level of family dysfunction, because go to all the studies. All the studies. Kids need parents, need dads. I ran the Colorado Department of Corrections for 3 years. 7 out of 10 inmates had never at any point in their life lived with their natural father. It was the most identifying characteristic of an inmate over and above race, education, drug abuse, whatever. 7 out of 10 had never at any point in their life lived with their natural father. So we're not just talking even about divorce here. We're talking about never was there a father on the scene. Brian, I just think that is so causal of a lot of what's going on in our country that it's my hope that we're going to see a renaissance in the American family and start moving back the other way.
And I hope you're right. With that, we're going to open up for questions to the audience. I need to just make the disclaimer that we are videotaping this, and we use that in some of our promotions. So I will repeat any questions that are needed. Richard, looks like you have a question back there.
What's going on behind the scenes between you and Holder and marijuana in Colorado?
Did everybody hear that question?
The question was what's going on between, I'll say myself, the governor, and Attorney General of the United States in regard to marijuana. Frankly, you know what's going on. I'll give you the quick summary. Voters approved legalization of marijuana 55-45 first Tuesday of November. That Friday, the governor and myself have a phone conference with Eric Holder, and we say, okay, here's the situation. The voters have told us marijuana is going to be legal on the state level. They're perfectly entitled to do that. Voters could legalize murder if they wanted to. But we're about to enter into a legislative session. Rules and regulations need to be set. People are going to start investing in this industry and things like that. We need some guidance because all this activity, as you well know, Mr. Attorney General, is in violation of federal law. What are you going to do about it? We need to know that. We want you to tell us by January 9th when the legislative session begins. I'll do that. Well, as you remember, he didn't say anything about it until the following, like late August, September. I honestly believe it was the president's call. And they kind of sent him a memo and said, these are our possibilities. I suspected they would do what they did because when we embarked on the medical marijuana deal, the federal government sent out something called the Ogden memo. A guy named Ogden was the Deputy Attorney General, and he authored a memo that said, he sent it out in January of 2009, just after the Obama administration took office, and said, even though medical marijuana is a violation of federal law, if people are in strict compliance with state medical marijuana laws, we're instructing federal law enforcement not to do anything about it. And so I wasn't surprised when they did a, can't remember what the guy's name is, the next Deputy Attorney General sent out a memo finally in August, September of last year saying, if you're in strict compliance with your state's law, federal law enforcement won't take action against you in regard to recreational marijuana unless one of these 3 things is happening. There's actually 8 things, but the 3 major things was there's significant diversion to children, there is significant diversion out of state, and there's remains criminal organizations in the business. That's a little bit of a naive statement because a lot of that is going to take place, but it's going to take place under even the thresholds the federal government. I used to be the U.S. Attorney. I know what thresholds are for the federal government. We didn't go out and bust people with small amounts of marijuana. You had to have, 250 pounds before the federal government cared. And so the fact of the matter is there is a great deal of diversion to kids. We have a adolescent marijuana use rate significantly above the national average because their use of marijuana is a function of their perception of risk. We've driven their perception of risk into the ground. They're using more. 23% of teenagers in Colorado smoked marijuana in the last month. 12% of them smoked 20 or more times. That is a ticket to some significant brain development issues. IQ loss, susceptibility to mental health issues, including psychosis. I think we're going to pay a fairly significant price. The federal government can't do anything about that. They're not going to stand in front of East High School when a guy comes out of the recreational store and walks over and sells it to high school kids. Diversion. Law enforcement estimated that a quarter of the medical marijuana grows were diverted out of state. If that is maintained in the recreational area, that's a huge, huge amount of marijuana that's going to flow out of the state. We will be, competing with Mexican cartels in all these other states for the marijuana trade. And then finally, if you think that by legalizing marijuana, we got the organized crime out of the drug business, you're naive. I'm not even sure they're going to get out of the marijuana business, but they are chomping at the bit to sell meth, heroin, cocaine to this larger pool of adolescent drug users. So we got our challenges set out for us. Let me, just my final point is in regard to the Attorney General. Yet we have this banking problem. As you know, by law, a federally chartered bank can't knowingly open an account for an activity in violation of federal law. So in order for all these folks out there that are, allegedly keeping books and paying taxes, we really want them to run this money through accounts. It's going to be a lot easier to keep track of. So we'd like to have them banking. And so the Colorado legislative delegation in Congress is saying, make an exception for the states that have legalized marijuana. Apparently there's no appetite for it in Congress. The southern states are saying, hey, that's your problem. If you want to, fry your brains, that's your problem. So then the Department of Justice issues a memo. As some of you in the banking industry know about this. They issued a memo to the banking industry saying, hey, all this is a violation of federal law, don't worry about it. Federal law enforcement won't come against you. Well, I've talked to not only Don Childers from the Banking Association, I've talked to the folks from the big banks in Colorado and saying, wait a minute, we got OCC to worry about. We got all kinds of bank regulators. They're not telling us to ignore the law. And oh, by the way, how do we know the next president of the United States is going to ignore the law? And that's within the statute of limitations. So they're not doing it. Now, I do think a lot of banks will start banking, but it will be the smaller ones, I believe. So that's what's going on.
Let me add another component to that from a real estate perspective, which is my primary business. Right now, if you have a building that's in a grow area, which there are a few in Denver, the prices that these people are willing to pay for these buildings is double and triple what a normal occupant can pay. So you say, well, how does that affect me? Well, think about if you have a widget company, an HVAC company, any kind of company, they can't get access to space. And if they can get access to space, that cost is going up significantly for them, which will be passed on to you, or those companies will go out of business. And so there's some unintended consequences with regards to that law that we don't, we see the headlines on the newspaper, but as an example, in Montbello Industrial Park, basically I-70 in Havana right now, the vacancy rate is less than 3%. So if you have an industrial company, you can't find space in Montbello Industrial Park. And you can't afford to be there because any of the growers will price you out all day long. As an example, $4 a square foot might be the rate. The marijuana people will pay $12 to $17 a square foot triple net. That's what I charge for this office building that I own right here, to give you context. Next question.
One more question to follow up. So the state of Colorado is able to collect taxes and put it into a bank. How does that affect?
The question is, Colorado takes these proceeds that are gained in violation of federal law and puts them in the bank. Are they able to take those? Guess what? Yeah, they are. Yeah. By the way, Brian, I got a question for you. So how many floors here are marijuana grows?
Certain things we can't disclose. No, I'm just kidding. None.
Yeah.
A lot of different things going on with Obamacare, and one of the things that's making the press is since the different states applied it differently and the whole idea of subsidies, where
Exchanges.
where is that as far as the legal standing? And
Okay, that's a great question. When the Attorney General's, eventually 28 of us sued, we had two claims for relief. One was that the mandate to buy a particular product or service was not a proper exercise of the Commerce Clause. The other issue was the expansion of Medicaid. One of the components of the Affordable Health Care Act is we are going to raise Medicaid eligibility. Used to be 100% of the federal poverty line. We're going to raise it to 133% of the federal poverty line. That will make about 15 to 20 million Americans eligible for Medicaid that were not previously eligible for Medicaid. Colorado, it's going to be between 250,000 and 350,000. But the Fed said this: if you don't allow this expansion, then you lose all Medicaid coverage. The Attorney General said that is so coercive as to violate federalism. The feds have long coerced state behaviors by the purse strings. For example, the reason why we have a 75-mile-an-hour speed limit, seatbelt law, motorcycle helmet law, is because the feds say, if you don't, we won't give you highway funds. And when those have been challenged in the past, the Supreme Court has said, well, this is okay, but there's a line out there somewhere that if you crossed it, it would be overly coercive. We said they've crossed it by saying, if you don't buy into this expansion, which even on a 90% federal, 10% state, in the first 5 years where the state's paying this addition, just the additional 10%, between 2016 and 2021, it's going to be an extra $1 billion for state taxpayers. You know anything about our budget? We don't have $1 billion. So we said it's overly coercive. The court said 7-2, you're right. So the Medicaid expansion became voluntary, okay? At the same time, the Affordable Health Care Act had this provision that encouraged states to set up their own exchange. And if they did not, the federal government would impose one. The state of Colorado decided to set up an exchange. And frankly, given the alternatives, I don't think that was a dumb decision. So we set up an exchange. The law reads that the federal government will subsidize insurance purchasers through the state exchanges. Through what I think was an oversight, it didn't say the government will subsidize purchasers through the federal exchange. So there's cases just making their way up now saying, hey, guess what? All these states that did not set up exchanges, you can't subsidize insurance purchases. The federal government's going to say, hey, we always make dumb mistakes. We always overlook things. It was a badly drafted statute. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And by the way, nobody read it, so how were we expected to know? So that's the issue there. I'm not sure how it's going to come out, but I am fairly confident that all these signups, the vast majority of them are people becoming eligible for Medicaid. And I think a disproportionate number of people that are even signing up for insurance are on the elder side of things and are going to be the ones demanding more health insurance. I think we'll find young people did not sign up in the numbers hoped for. That's just my guess. We'll wait and see how it shakes out.
Why don't we finish up with one more question, just because I'm wanting to be respectful of everybody's time. So whoever you'd like to call upon.
Gosh. Yeah, right there.
Oh, yeah. What are the common complaints you get in your office concerning small businesses? And what are the lessons that we can learn from those complaints? I'm just trying to bring it back from marijuana and bring it to entrepreneurs.
Advice for small businesses. Once again, if you're in a small business dealing with customers that can file complaints either with the Better Business Bureau or the Attorney General's office or something like that, my recommendation is if you get contacted to cooperate, we have no desire to get crosswise with businesses. And for example, if it is strictly a contractual dispute, we will say we won't get involved. But if there's an allegation in terms of deceptive advertising or something that's within our jurisdiction and we contact you, I would really encourage you to pick up the phone and say, yeah, here's why we did what we did. And if some employee, said some things that weren't true, we'll resolve it, stuff like that. I really think that, I know that I preach, and hopefully my successors will preach the importance of the business community and being as business friendly as we can possibly be to those that are obeying the law, and still take to task those that are violating the law. And I think we feel pretty seriously about that. And so my advice would be, if you ever do run crosswise with our office. Now, if we're sending you a letter telling you you're a grand jury target, don't call us, call a lawyer. But if we're just saying, hey, we got this complaint, somebody said that they responded to an advertisement and then we're told something different, call us and say, hey, either that didn't happen or let's make it right and cooperate with us. Brian, I want to give you a copy of my book, Becoming a Good Ancestor, because I think you're going to become one. And I'm going to give two door prizes. Today is April 17th, right? Correct. Who's got the closest birthday?
The 8th.
That's pretty close. Anybody closer than April 8th?
Oh, no.
Okay, April 8th gets one. And then, I'm big on families. Who's been married the longest to the same spouse? Over 25 years? Over 30?
No way.
Over 35? Oh, okay, just one? Anybody else over 35? Okay, here's our winner. Okay, thank you very much.
John, I want to thank you for your comments. Absolutely informational, and appreciate those. And I also want to thank you for your service to our state and to our country. So with that, let's give him another round. As you all know, there's an Attorney General race this year in Colorado, and I hope that you see the magnitude of the man that stood before you. And regardless of your political affiliation, this is a non-partisan group here, I hope that you will look for the right candidate, because you look at how much they impact our state. We want to make sure we have the right person at the helm for the right reasons. So be educated about it, please, as you go through that process. Upcoming, I wanted to tell you about our next speaker, Tom Shane. Now, if you know Tom, you hear him on the radio, a few people know him. Tom actually used to be in this building, and when I bought it, I looked in every nook and cranny for diamonds. I haven't found one yet, but I'm still looking. But if you don't know, Tom is the largest private jeweler in the United States of America. He has about 24 locations, and he's going to be coming and sharing his wisdom with regards to jewelry business. And that is on May 15th. On June 19th, we have Doug Simmons. He's the president of Enstrom Candies. From my area on the western slope. There you go, Al. I like that. You gotta have the toffee. We like that at our house. And he lives over in Grand Junction. They manufacture their candies here in Colorado. On July 17th, we have Dick Franklin. He's the director of the Clean Tech Open and father of U.S. Olympian Missy Franklin. On August 21st, we have John Harple. He is the founder and president of Mercator Energy, a natural gas services brokerage and research company representing both producers and end users. On September 18th, we have Josh Stewart. He's the founder and CEO of XJet. XJet opened its flagship location at Denver Centennial Airport in 2007, and plans are underway to launch their first global hub in Dubai. On October 16th, we have Bruce Benson, president of the University of Colorado, the longest serving CU president in more than half a century, and he also has extensive background in the uranium industry, and it should be fascinating to hear from him. I want to thank our advisory board who has helped us. I also want to thank Elle and Antoinette for helping put all this together. You would not be eating or drinking without them, so thank you for that. I want to thank the Innovation Pavilion. The Innovation Pavilion, this entity here on the first floor, over 80 companies have been founded here in the last couple of years. And youngest entrepreneur is in middle school, and the oldest is in their 80s, and everything in between. And they're having a dramatic impact in Colorado. So if you don't know about them, reach out and learn a little bit more. I also want to encourage all of you. We give away scholarships to people who are trying to get into business, trying to get training, and trying to create opportunity in Colorado. And you can go on our website and make recommendations. Half of your ticket cost is going to scholarships, and half is going to underwrite the food and the drink here each evening. If you know of any speakers that we should reach out to, please contact me about that. And in closing, I just want to reiterate one of the important things that John said. to become a good ancestor. Think about that for a moment and what that means to you in your life. To become a good ancestor as you go home and you interact with your family and your children tonight, as you show up to work tomorrow, and as you try to go out and make a positive impact in the world. Become a good ancestor. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.